Thomas Carlyle, one of the balmiest of all Victorian historians, once said a very good thing about Western civilization. He said its roots were held in three things: gunpowder, printing, and the Protestant religion. Well, obviously, those last two, printing and Protestantism, really joined hands in Wittenberg, and they'd exploded throughout Europe together. Gunpowder, of course, tripped along behind in the wars that it caused. Because it did cause wars, it caused terrible commotion all over Europe. People were burnt from the earliest days as heretics. It was a terrible time for Europe. Christendom was coming to an end. And it took the Church of Rome nearly 50 years to get its act together, to actually consider this immense split in Western civilization. And already in that time, of course, thousands and thousands of Protestants had already been burnt as being heretics. But eventually, they convened a council, and there they looked into the business of the Bible and its translators. They came down, as one might expect, that their Bible, the Old Bible, the great Latin Bible of St. Jerome, was the real Bible. That, they said, held the very word of God in it. All other Bibles, all their translators, mothers of heresy. Luther, of course, was safe enough here in his great castle. He was called the Pope of Wittenberg by his enemies. He must have been greatly envied by all these Protestants who came here to see one of the fathers of the Reformation. One of those was an Englishman, William Tyndale. He was a young man, he was on the run, but he wrote some of the finest prose the English language has ever seen. He would also be the greatest translator of the English Bible. We owe a lot to Tyndale. It must have been a very poignant meeting here between the great German and this poor Englishman.
Which of you, though he taketh thought therefore, could put 1 cubit unto his stature? And why care ye then for raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They labor not, neither spin. And yet for all that, I say unto you that even Solomon in all his royalty was not arrayed like unto one of these. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass which is today in the field, tomorrow it shall be cast in the furnace.
Those words are Tyndale's. And they go from Tyndale's Bible straight into the King James Bible. And that, you might say, is one of the foundations of modern England, certainly the modern English language. And that, of course, is why Tyndale, the man, is so important. It's not just that the words of Jesus Christ that you know in English, the Tyndale's words, now that's amazing in itself. It's more than that. It's the tone of this book he made. Its oddness, its grandeur, its rhythm. He somehow managed to capture something of England, something of its very Englishness. Perhaps he even made some of it himself, who knows? And yet this man who did so much for England is actually a very odd Englishman. He lived abroad, he spoke foreign languages most of his life, this man, this writer of perfect prose. He was always on the run, he was a passionate preacher. He liked Martin Luther. Very few people like Martin Luther in England. They really didn't like him at all. Tyndale followed Martin Luther. So this great Englishman, he's rather an odd Englishman. But that's where the story of the King James Bible begins. In 1525, Tyndale was on the run, carrying the first printed sheets of his Bible, the first Bible in English, from one German city to another. 10 years later, he had been betrayed, and after a year in prison at Brussels, he was executed. The last thing Tyndale asked for from his prison was a Hebrew grammar to help him with a new translation of the Old Testament. He was now so famous that the executioners allowed him the dignity of being strangled before they burned him. "Lord, open the King of England's eyes," he's supposed to have said as he was being killed. For in England, though there was a great demand for a Bible in English, King Henry VIII would not allow them in his churches. Henry, whose coins were the first to announce that British monarchs are all defenders of the faith, saw very little reason to support the Protestants. They seemed to be questioning the divine right, the God-given right of kings to rule their subjects. Here's one of poor Tyndale's Bibles. Very small, very suitable for smuggling. Printed in Antwerp, this one, brought into England. The New Testament, diligently corrected and compared with the Greek by William Tyndale. It had an extraordinary history, this book. It actually caused the British government to pass new laws against customs and excise. These were brought in all sorts of devious and diverse ways. Some were actually burnt at St. Paul's in London. I don't think it was exactly the prose style they didn't like. I think it was the things he called the profitable annotations, those little remarks and explanations that were so heavily influenced by Luther. Because Luther, of course, his works were also being burnt at exactly that same time in England. And then, of course, he translated some words in a way which seemed to sort of level everybody. Priests became seniors. Kings somehow weren't so mighty in Tyndale's eyes, and that didn't please the authorities either. The next part of the English Bible story is really an extraordinary development. It's this great book, Cranmer's Bible, the Bible in English. Henry VIII, who had seen Tyndale being burnt abroad and done very little to stop it, just 2 years after his death, saw this magnificent book put into all the churches of England. And this is basically Tyndale's Bible. It's part, really, of that incredibly complicated and bloody history of the Reformation, as Henry VIII slowly leaves the Catholic Church and forms the Church of England. Now, the problem here is that the Catholic Church, the Catholic world, gave the king an incredible quantity of sacredness. And somehow in this new Protestant world, Henry had to retain that. And one of the ways they chose was using the Bible. So here's the king, Henry VIII himself, doing a sort of delicate balancing act, and he's got his hands on the Word of God. 2 Bibles there. And there's his ministers, his Chancellor, Thomas Cromwell, his Archbishop, Cranmer, and he's handing them their Bibles, and they're passing them down to the common people right at the bottom, and they're all screaming out, "God save the king!" Or some of them are shouting out, "Vivat Rex," the slightly more educated ones, I suppose. This Bible was so popular in the church that it said that in old St. Paul's, when 8 of these copies were opened on a Sunday, it was full up with people pushing into the church and pushing each other off of the lectern stand so they could read the Bible. It had never been read by the common people before. There was a great well of literacy in England, and yet nobody had a Bible to read. But all that lovely investigation of the Bible had to stop. Protestant Henry died, and his Catholic daughter Mary came to the throne, and she started to persecute the Protestants. When Mary died, Elizabeth came to the throne, and she started to persecute the Catholics. Exiles went abroad, just like Tyndale, and both of those groups of exiles produced their Bibles. After Mary and Elizabeth, King James, and King James's great Bible. In a way, the Bible itself is a part of that balancing act that the kings were having to do. It's a sort of a delicate act where Majesty lays his hands on the holy word. To the most high and mighty prince, James, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. As soon as he come to the throne, the Puritans, the hard-line Protestants in England, had hit him with petition upon petition. His great Bible was a part of a deal he'd struck with them to revise the habits of the church and its great book. In fact, it's a triumph for the committee system. More than 40 scholars worked on it. They took all the previous Bibles, revised them, and made that greatest treasure of the English language. 90% of it is Tyndale's, the little books that were first smuggled into England. But now his language was appearing under the royal seal itself. There, right at the front of the Bible, the seal of King James. The kings themselves, however, didn't do quite so well. The royal balancing act between sacredness and sort of ordinary rulership had failed completely. James's reign has been called by one historian a prelude to a disaster. His son, of course, Charles, went to the scaffold when the Puritans, those same people who had bargained with James over the content and order of his great Bible, when the Puritans led Charles out onto the scaffold in Whitehall, He shouted at them, "Remember, a sovereign and his subjects are clean different things." Charles actually lived in that same age of sacredness as the Bible was conceived in. And when his head was chopped off and the executioner picked it up and held it out to the crowd, they said a great groan went through the crowd. It must have been a horrible thing to see, but I think there was something more terrible going on there. What was going on was the death of something sacred, the death of sacred kingship, which stretched back to the pharaohs, perhaps even to the patriarchs themselves. Now, that sacredness is in Tyndall's Bible, it's in James's Bible, it's in the Bible we still use today. That Bible was made in that ancient age of faith. You know, if Petrarch had gone to sleep on top of his mountain for 500 years, like Rip Van Winkle or something, and then woken up and come down here, I don't think he'd feel that much out of place. After all, looks like a Gothic cloister, doesn't it? But this isn't 1270 in the south of France. This is 1870 Oxford. And we know better than Petrarch, don't we? Because when we look at buildings like this, we don't think they're Gothic cloisters. We think, what's this then? Is it a swimming bath, a wimpy bar, a theatre, a railway station? What the hell is it? Well, actually, this one is a museum. So that means that all the little rooms off of these cloisters where the monks would have prayed for the soul of the world for 8 hours a day are actually filled up with professors. Professors of the natural sciences who were ordering, regulating the world. They're doing just the same job as the monks did in some sort of a way, is that's giving the rest of us mortals an idea of our place in the world, of our place in society. Which is, after all, what the monks were trying to do, which was to create a human society that was at one in the universe with its God. But these guys, of course, they're not very good at organising a whole cosmos from archangels to peasants. They only do birds and bees these days. This is a rather lonely universe. Petrarch's vision, if you think about it, was a very wide, clear vision, but it was a very lonely one. We've lost the God. Sacredness is somehow dissolved. And perhaps that's why these Gothic cloisters have got such a terrible air of desperation in them. It's a